I'm going to talk today about a project that was done about 10 years ago, actually a little bit longer than 10 years ago, for NASA in the United States, the U.S. Space Agency. But I did want to talk a little bit about some basic stuff too, because I've actually been here doing some work at the National Library Board and talking about various types of knowledge organization systems. So I want to talk a little bit about that and then talk about the NASA project and then answer any questions and discuss anything you'd like to discuss with me. The first thing is that knowledge organization systems, or KOS, create order and make sense of things. So what you see on the left is there's an artist whose name is Ursus Worley. He happens to be Swiss, who does a lot of curious things. And one thing he does is a form of performance art where he takes things in the real world and creates order. Here we have a parking lot, which looks like a typical parking lot, and he's managed to organize all the people so they can move their cars and organize them by color. He also does many other things, and if you look up his name or the art of cleanup or a term called nulling, K-N-O-L-L-I-N-G, I learned is the term that technically describes this process of laying things out in an orderly way. There's a whole kind of culture of this online that I've discovered. Well, sometimes this is exactly what we're doing. We're taking things in the real world which are rather messy and trying to make them a bit more orderly for the purpose of being able to make more sense out of it, to detect patterns. So what's the purpose? So I mentioned that knowledge organization systems help us make sense out of things, but there's some specific kinds of operations that we want to do with information that knowledge organization systems facilitate. And they kind of go along these lines. So translation, so translating the language of usually people who are trying to get information into the language that exists in an application or a system. They're not always the same, and we need to make that translation. And sometimes it's a simple translation of concepts. Sometimes it's a linguistic translation from one actual language to another. It could be from a nomenclature or into a nomenclature. There are many different varieties of this. The next thing is consistency. So if you're building an information system, one of the objectives is to create complete and consistent information so you can get better results from it. And that's a big purpose of knowledge organization systems, to help us do this. Semantics is another aspect of knowledge organization systems. And this would be specifying the relationships between things. And there are three types of relationships that are used in semantics. One of them is equivalence, and that's the simplest at some level, and it's synonyms, and other words and phrases that are being linked together to mean identified as the same thing. The second type is hierarchy, broader or narrower concepts, wholes and parts, instances of, and so on. And the third one are related or associative concepts. And that's the one that's particularly tricky because it's difficult for us to make decisions about how things are related, what things ought to be related, and then specifically how they're related. And doing this in a way that doesn't add noise to the system and actually adds value is a difficult thing, and requires decisions about guideline and decisions and the definition of guidelines for doing this in an orderly way. Then on the use side, there are two general ways that we look for and find information. One of them is browsing, so looking about for things as we do on the web, and the other is retrieval, where we specifically ask for things, and then we often use browse and retrieve together. We enter a few words, we create a collection of results. The search engine tries to rank them by relevance, but may or may not get the context that we're looking for, and then we would browse through that collection, possibly refine that query. All of those interactions and all of those kinds of organization methods and techniques are central to knowledge organization systems. So in knowledge organization systems, we're frequently using words and phrases, and we're trying to make them orderly and consistent. And again, another way to look at this whole thing is to look at it from the perspective of vocabulary. So we're trying to make words clear so that we understand what they are. So I just spent most of this week working with a bunch of librarians at the National Library. Their number one problem is ambiguity. Now, I didn't know that, and I didn't believe that until I sat with them for a couple of days, and it was pretty clear. Ambiguity is their number one problem. How do we know the two entities are the same entity? And it seems like a very, very basic problem, and it is a very, very basic problem. But it's a difficult one, and it's one that's very important. It could be simply the different ways that an organization is known by or referred to, and it can get complex pretty quickly. But a simple example is an acronym, and we're going to talk about NASA in a bit, a scientific agency, and scientific agencies and large organizations. It's well known that they use lots and lots of acronyms and abbreviations. And as we like to say, the first thing you get when you go to work in one of these organizations is a secret decoder ring, which allows you to understand when people talk what the gibberish is that they're directing towards you, which is frequently abbreviations, acronyms, special words and phrases that mean something particular in this organization. So eliminating ambiguity is a very common and extremely important aspect. Then controlling synonyms. So acronyms and abbreviations is one thing, but when we look at words and phrases within the language, we get involved with general synonyms, and that's a difficult problem. And in particular, the issue is how do we decide which one is the label that's going to be preferred and which one is the label that's going to be a synonym. And whether it matters or not depends an awful lot on the particular application. But it's a big problem, and it's very political in organizations. So having methods and processes and guidelines in order to make decisions about what are going to be preferred labels and being sure that you're able to get to the right label regardless of how you approach it is very important. And then establishing these relationships explicitly between words and phrases. It's one thing to do it, it's another to do it in a way that allows us to actually use this in an information system. And then finally, testing, validating, and maintaining all of this is a great challenge. It's not done in one. It's something that actually has to go on continuously because language in organizations, just as in the wild, changes all the time. So how do we decide things like what's the right label to use? How do we decide that? We're just people, and we have a point of view. So we need to have some basis for this. So traditionally, the way that decisions were made was based on how these words and phrases appeared in print. But obviously, we live in a world that's not so print-oriented. And even if we said whether it's in print or it's online, the same idea is something that's called literary warrant. Basically, what's the label that's most commonly used when we communicate these concepts? But there's other warrants that are important as well and that need to be taken into consideration. One of them is organizational warrant, and that's basically what's the official name of something. So I just spent the week with a government agency, and at the end of the day, again, one of the big issues was how do we decide if we don't know for sure, if there's no clear guidance on this? And the answer is that you either are empowered to make this decision because you are an agency which has the responsibility to do this, or in fact there is an entity that has the authority to do this, and they've just said this is the name. It doesn't really matter whether it's the most commonly used form. It's what the official form is, and sometimes that's what you use. And then finally, there's a newer notion, which is user warrant. And just as we're living in a world of user-generated content, users are extremely important, and what users do, as opposed to what we'd like them to do, is an important consideration. So sometimes we decide that we want to do what the users say. And again, these are all issues that come up when we're trying to develop knowledge organization systems for an organization. So all of this sort of happens across this continuum. And what I'd like, the point I want to make in this rather lengthy introduction is that we can look at knowledge organization schemes in a very simple way on a continuum. There are different types of them, and that continuum is based on the type of relationships that are being managed in them. So some knowledge organization schemes are very simple. They're just controlled lists. They're just words and phrases that are official, and sometimes they're simply drop-down lists. Sometimes they're much longer. But and the situation that we see them especially useful is in conjunction with search engines, where we create synonym rings. And synonym rings are simply, usually just text files, which have a list of words and phrases and synonyms that ought to automatically refer to this other term. So, and an example would be certain abbreviations and acronyms. And that's very simple, but it's actually very important and very useful and used to a large extent with search engines. In the middle, we get into things that relate to hierarchical classification, broader and narrower terms, whole parts, instances of. And classification systems are a good example, or simple classification systems are a good example of this. And we see this quite a lot in things like organizational charts. You know, it's a classic kind of hierarchy. It's very simple, but it's very powerful. It's a bit more complex because you might have also variations of equivalence. But hierarchy is interesting because we can either use the hierarchy to find specific things, but we can also infer from location in a hierarchy certain things about that entity, so that a department is part of an agency, or one concept is part of a broader concept. And the more complex ones, or most complex ones, introduce associative relationships, which are saying things are related to other things. In the most complex form, we have things that are called ontologies. And ontologies have one specific characteristic, which is that we don't only say things are related, we express certain types of relatedness, and we make that explicit in ways that can sometimes be used to drive experiences or information retrieval. So I'm going to talk about the NASA taxonomy, so we should talk about taxonomy, in particular, what the heck is it? So it's a type of controlled vocabulary, and a good example is something like this, which is kind of a library example. We've got fiction and nonfiction, and nonfiction can be broken up into types of nonfiction: biography, history, politics. And then that might be further subdivided, for example, by region or by period. The taxonomy that we're going to talk about from NASA is something that's a faceted taxonomy, so we need to say a few words about what do we mean by faceted. So a mathematician librarian, S.R. Ranganathan, who is an Indian person, developed these notions quite a while ago in the 1920s, long before computers. So it was a notion that comes out of an interest to organize books in libraries. He also is known for the invention of the bookmobile. So he's someone who's actually very focused on delivering library services to people. Anyway, he developed a system called the colon classification, and it's pretty much behind this idea of faceted classification. And in his system, he decided that there were some basic universals, I like to call them, that are aspects of information that kind of transcend the domain or the specific areas of information that we might have. That an item has some sort of personality, and to him, personality meant topic or orientation. That it also might relate to things or matter, or materials if we're talking about objects. Energy would be actions, so techniques and methods. Space would be places and locations, and time would be time and time periods. So, and some of these aren't that unusual, but because we see them embodied in lots of information systems, but trying to lay them out this way is and was unusual. And colon classification was used in some institutions. It wasn't that widely adopted, but it came back as an area of interest in the 1960s and 70s when researchers, particularly in the UK, kind of rediscovered it, and later on it became a very important motivation for the development of some computer-based faceted classification schemes. Among them is one called the Art and Architecture Thesaurus, in a totally different domain than what Ranganathan was thinking about. And I had the privilege of working with that project for 10 years in the 1980s and 90s. And that's now available as a linked open data service on the web. So if you search for Getty Vocabularies or Art and Architecture Thesaurus, and there's some good descriptions of what a faceted classification is. But the Art and Architecture Thesaurus broke up these areas and applied them to all of material culture. So not just art and not just architecture, but also to all kinds of things. So transportation artifacts, they call them, also known as cars, trains, and planes, and other types of things like that, as well as cooking utensils, musical instruments. Pretty much everything in the world is covered in some way and was thought of in this context. So it's a very pervasive notion. And the important idea here is this idea, are there universal ways to think about stuff? Today, we see this all the time in online commerce. This is when we shop for shoes on an online website, and we type in a few words, and then we start to click through categories, usually on the left-hand side, sometimes elsewhere, that in 3 or 4 or 5 clicks take us from a notion of a certain type of item that we're looking for to a specific instance that meets certain criteria, which could be as mundane or specific as price, but often has other characteristics as well that relate to these things. It has a certain color, it has a certain size, it has a certain shape, it's for a certain purpose. And those are all notions that are embodied in this idea of faceted classification. So facets are discrete branches of a taxonomy, and this idea of online commerce is sometimes referred to as taxonomic metadata or guided navigation, and you see it quite a lot. What it actually is a set of controlled vocabularies that are organized according to these broad principles. Another example that's frequently given is wine, which we typically think of being from a region, having a certain type, white or red, and perhaps a price. So region, type, or price is a good example of a faceted classification. So how is taxonomy different from library cataloging? Primarily, it's what we would call a post-coordinated indexing system. And in English, that means that instead of trying to put an item on the shelf in one place, which means we have to identify all the possible aspects so that we can put it in that place, in a post-coordinate system, we can simply work our way through these categories independently, and they work a bit more like a menu, where you can have an option from column A and an option from column B, and you don't have to specify the combinations beforehand. You can choose them as you move along. So that's a bit of a long introduction, but I wanted to give a little more detail than just sort of jump into the case study.